This is the companion video for Worksheet 15. In this one, we're going to revisit an old exercise and add a little bit more functionality to it. We're going to rework the ball collector so that we can save data between the scenes. This is a really important and useful concept when you're making video games, since each time you load a new scene, you don't want all brand new data. So we're going to kind of practice with this one. If you remember, the way that this one functions is we have a ball rolling around. You click the start and you have a timer, and it keeps track of how long it takes for you to successfully run into all of the colored cubes. So what we're going to do though is we are going to save what the shortest game is. So each time you win, it's going to check to see if you have the shortest game, and if you do, it's going to save that information, write it to the screen, and then when the scene reloads, it's going to keep that information. Since if you kind of remember, the way that we programmed this one was so that when you win and you click play again, it just reloads the game. And normally if we did that, it would wipe out any kind of saved variable that we have, but we are going to learn how to keep that information even though we reload the scene. So if you haven't read this website, make sure that you do that. It is a useful one. We're not going to do the entire website for this. If you like this information, you want to keep going, feel free, but we are going to work all the way just to get it working. We're not going to do any of this polishing where it starts talking about doing like serialized stuff. We're going to be learning some interesting concepts. If this is your last programming class, at least you'll have an understanding of how to do some basic stuff. And if you go on with programming and take other programming courses, you're definitely going to keep working on and doing similar stuff, dealing with this concept of classes and serializable stuff down here. So if you really like it and you have some free time, I would recommend trying to go through and learn the whole thing. But we're just going to focus on this upper part here where we talk about making our global controller. So how does this function? What we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating something kind of referred to in programming as a singleton object. And the whole purpose of a singleton object is that no matter where you are in your code and where it's running, there is only one instance ever of that object. So that is why we're going to be calling ours like the global controller, because it's a global object. It's for the whole entire game, and it stays consistent through the whole thing. There can be only one of it ever, and that's kind of like why it's called a singleton, because it's a single thing. So we're going to write some code when we make it to make sure that we only ever have one, and it's going to persist through the entire game, even if we reload the scene. So it's a very easy concept. It's just a new script. It's going to be its own object. We're actually going to make a prefab of it, because you always want to make sure that every scene that you make has one of these objects in it. Even if you start in a new scene, like when you start working with multiple scenes, you can never tell when your game's going to load. So like, what if you start on level 2 rather than level 1? You want to make sure that you have your singleton object. So it's going to be in every single level. So that's why it's good to make a prefab. So each time you make a level, you can just drop it in and call it a day. So with that, like I said, read the website first before you watch this video if you haven't, so you get kind of like an idea of what we're doing. But I'm going to step you through how to set up this object for this project. So first things first, I do want to kind of talk a little bit about a couple of changes I made to the original project that you should be able to do on your own. The first one was I added this shortest text object to the UI, and that's going to store our shortest, that's going to display what the shortest game is. So if we go to my code, I made sure to put that in here. shortest text right here so that we can write to it. And I believe that's the only thing I've added so far to it, to get you kind of caught up. The way that we're going to do this is, it shouldn't really depend on how you did your code, because we're going to kind of make it independent of whatever the guts were for this. So we're going to deal with stuff with like in the start and in the check for when, and then we're going to also make our own functions that we call in there. So regardless of what you did in here, we should be able to, you should be able to still follow along with this. So I actually want to make my global controller first before I start to try to implement this into my game. Excuse me. So I'm going to go over, back to Unity, and in my scripts folder, I'm going to make a new C# script. I'm going to call it global controller. Ooh, my caps is on. Let's try that again. I'm going to open that up. Maybe I'll open it up. Let's see. Where is it? Let's try again. There it is. And we don't need any of this stuff in here, actually. We can delete this all out. But we need to start coding in here. And what we first need to do is we want to call this class into existence. And what that means is that we want to make sure that we have one version of this global controller existing in our game. And we're going to store that in a public static, and it's our global controller because that's the name of our script. Sorry about that. And we're going to call this global controller in our script instance. And what this is going to do is it's kind of like almost like referring to itself. It says, hey, this global controller class script, we exist, and we're called instance. And we're going to call ourselves into existence. We're going to make sure that we exist. And I'll kind of explain this a little bit better once I type out the code. So bear with me. And let me just get the code typed out, and then I'll explain exactly what it is. We're going to do a private void awake, and this awake is a Unity specific keyword. It occurs before start. So when we begin, this is going to fire as one of the very first things that the code does. And that's kind of important for the rest of our code. So it does need to be in our awake function, but it should turn blue because this is a Unity specific thing. And we're going to say if instance is equal to null. That means if this doesn't exist yet, if this hasn't been created, we're going to say don't destroy unload game object. And we're going to say instance is equal to this. Else if instance is not equal to this, destroy game object. So when you're working with this kind of concept of this global controller, or like this singleton that's going to store information between scenes, this is the first thing you're going to want to type in, is this awake function. And what does this all mean? So remember, instance is like a version, like it's saying like this whole global controller thing, you can almost think of it like a container that's going to eventually contain our shortest time information. And we could have it contain a lot of other things. Like, for instance, if this was a character, you could have it hold onto your hit points, your magic points, any potions, any keys, like how many of those you have, so that if you're changing scenes, it would be stored inside of instance. That's what this is. Think of it, this is called instance. Like, Think of it almost like a little pouch that you're holding all that information in, and that pouch is named instance, which is this thing. So if this has not been created yet, that's what instance equals null. If we haven't created one, we're creating one right here. And this don't destroy unload is key. What this means is if we create this, never destroy it even if we reload the scene. So don't destroy instance if we reload or load a new scene. Instance is equal to this means that we are setting this to itself. It seems kind of strange, but we're just making sure that what we just created, this thing, which is, we're creating it on this, game object, we are ourself. Because this next part is important. So we're saying if we don't exist, create ourselves and set us equal to ourselves. Otherwise, if something does exist, like if this does exist and we're not equal to ourselves, get rid of this, because this means it's trying to make another version of global controller, and we don't want that. So destroy what we just, destroy ourselves, because we're not equal to the one and only global controller called instance. So with that said, what we want to do now is we want to create any kind of variable in here that we want to store between scenes. And for our ball collector, that's just one thing. All we care about is what the shortest time was. So we're going to make a public float called shortest time. And now, since once this gets created, whatever is being stored in shortest time won't destroy between scenes. And we can just look at this and read that information. And you'll see that when we get over to our player controller and we start implementing this. The other thing I want to do is I want to come down here, and after we create ourselves, I want to set shortest time equal to -1.0f. This should only occur the very first time that this instance is created, so that we can then look at our shortest time. And if our shortest time is -1, we know that we're playing our first game. We haven't actually played yet. It's kind of like a good fail-safe. Like otherwise, nothing's going to be stored in here. I always kind of like to put information in there, even if it's just temp information or just some information in a way that I can tell that we haven't actually written to it yet. This is also a good practice that if you're creating this for the first time, like let's say that you have an RPG and you want to test out different levels, but you're doing your character creator in your first scene. But if you jump to, like, say, scene 3, that's like, like a level that you want to walk through, and you have your global controller in there, and you bypass through that character creator because you never actually played it, you need some kind of default information in there, or else all of your hit points and potions will just have nothing in it, since that would be the first time this wakes up. So it's just kind of good habit to get into putting something in here just so it's not nothing. But this -1, the reason it's -1 is, your shortest game can never be negative. So I know that if I do get a negative game, I'm playing my first game, so whatever my first time is always going to be my shortest time. So that's actually it for typing in the global controller. So I'm going to save this, and I do want to make sure I'm implementing this into Unity. So I'm going to go back to Unity. I'm going to make a new empty, and I'm going to call it global controller. All I need to do is put my global controller script on it, and since this is a public, we can actually see what's going on in here. And sometimes, at least with this new stuff, this can be a really great way to troubleshoot to make sure that things are working correctly. For instance, watch what happens now. We have global controller, our script is on there. Watch what happens when I press start. We create this new thing. Look at this. Do not destroy on load. So anything that's kind of in this hierarchy now in here means that when the scene reloads, it's not going to disappear. It's going to stay what it is the first time it was created. And if we click on global controller, we can see that our shortest time is set to -1. Since this is the first time it was created, we have it set to -1. So this is going to be really easy now if we need to do some troubleshooting, that if something's not working, we can kind of figure out, what is it thinking. So we know that it is reading the shortest time correctly, and it's storing it, it's having our first value of -1 in there. So make sure that this is working. If it's not, for some reason, I would try to go back and troubleshoot why you're not getting this the way it is. Most likely, you might have forgotten to type this in correctly. This is an important line. So hopefully you have a little bit of an understanding on how this works. The next part is going to be to actually implement this into the player controller. Since the player controller in this one is the one that is doing like the timer, and it's looking at things and it's interacting with things, we're going to want the player controller to first look at the global controller to see what the shortest time is being stored as. And at the end, we're going to need to write to the global controller so that if we do have a new shortest time, it's going to store that information in here before the scene reloads. So player controller. The first thing, like I said, I did add that public text, shortest text, so I can write to it. But we're going to need another class level variable, and we're going to need that shortest time in here too, since we're going to need to first read it from global controller, and then we're going to need to check it against what the time is when we're done playing. And I'm going to make this public just so that we can take a look at what it's doing in the editor, because again, it might be a little bit easier to make sure that things are working correctly if we can see it as the game is running. So public float, I'm just going to call this shortest time. Why not? Shortest time. So that it lines up with the data that we're keeping in our global controller. The first thing we want to do is when the game starts, we want to read what the shortest time is from global controller. So I'm going to do that in my start, since it's going to fire the awake first and turn it on, and if it's the first time. Otherwise, it's going to already exist in the world. But we want to do it in our start because we want to make sure that global controller is turned on. So we don't want to do awake in here. So we will come down probably here before we generate our cubes. Might as well, since it's a variable, we need to make sure we're setting it correctly. We're going to say shortest time, which is this, is equal to global controller. And this should start popping up if you did make it first. Dot instance dot shortest time. So what is all this stuff? We're saying that we want to look at this script, the global controller script. We want to take a look at the instance object in there, which is this. And remember, this is when if we create it, we set it equal to itself. So that's where that word comes from, instance is what we call our persistent version of all of this. Specifically, inside of that instance, we want to see what's being stored in that shortest time variable, which is this. So the first time it's created, it's going to say -1f. And once we get some more coding in, it'll eventually have other times in there too. So we're setting that this equal to it's, this. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to actually make a new function for the next part so that it's a little bit easier to implement this. And it's a good, it's a good methodology to do anyway, that if we're doing like a specific block of code, that we kind of make its own function. So I'm going to make a new function, and it's going to be called update shortest game. And all this is going to do is it's going to update that text on the screen with what our shortest game is. And we are going to call it first and start, after we get it, to make sure that, we don't have any kind of weirdness in there. And I'll just make sure, I'm just going to type it in right here underneath the start, since I'm just going to kind of condense all the new stuff together. So this will just be a private void, update shortest game. And what we want to do is, if we're in our first game, we want to tell the player that you're in your first game. There isn't a shortest game because there hasn't been one played left. And if it's not the first game, we want to just take this information and display it in the same format that our timer has been displayed in. So pretty easy, just some if statements, if else. So if shortest time that we grabbed from global controller, we're going to say is less than or equal to, just to make sure, because it should never be 0 anyway. You can never have a shortest game that length. 0.0f. So if we are 0 or less, which we set it to -1, so the first game will always be this. We're going to say the shortest text dot text is equal to shortest game. We're in our first game, so we're not too concerned about displaying anything else. If it's not that, we want to just display what is in shortest game. We're not too worried yet about if this is actually our shortest game. We're just assuming whatever is being stored in here is the shortest game. We're going to deal with updating if it is the shortest game in another spot. So don't worry about that. So if we want to display this as our shortest, we're just going to do a little bit of copy and pasting. If you did follow that one video to implement your timer, it should be very similar to mine. But I'm just going to come down here to where I did my original timer and copy this on how to change stuff to minutes and seconds. I'm going to come back up here and paste this in. But if you do need to type this in, you can do that. The only change is I just need to change current time to shortest time, since that's what we're trying to convert, is whatever is being stored in shortest time. So we'll get our minutes and seconds, and then we'll just say shortest text.text is equal to shortest game plus minutes plus seconds. And we'll now be able to display that. So we called this first in the start, and then we're going to end up calling it again. But we should be able to see if it's working a little bit. So I would save it, hop back over here, make sure that you go to your player and you make sure that you attach that shortest text in here. Might as well keep this open too, because we can see what our shortest time is. Since we hit play, it's going to first trigger that global controller and that awake, and then we're going to read that. So this should display -1 after we hit play. And we are getting shortest time is -1, and since it is -1, we're telling the player that this is your first game, so don't worry about a shortest game. We don't have one yet. All right, we're on a roll. So let's do the next part of the implementation. We're reading it The next part is after we win, we have to make sure that we're checking to see if we have the shortest game. So I'm actually going to put this in our check for win first. Let's write the function that we're going to do. Make sure. Hold on a second. So we are going to, if our counter is equal to 0, that means we won. And we're done. We're ready to play again. But we are going to first call a function that we're going to code out in a second called save game state. And in here, we're going to see if our new time is the shortest. If it is the shortest, we're going to write it to the global controller so that it'll store it between scene loads. And after we save our game state, we're going to then update the text. Update, what did I call it? Sorry about that. Update shortest game. So we'll check, and if it's shortest, we'll update it. Otherwise, it's going to stay the same, and then we'll just make sure that we are writing it again in case it is shorter. If it's not shorter, it shouldn't write then. So let me add it down here underneath update shortest game. We're going to do private void save game state. And this is only going to fire after we win. And all we're doing is checking to see if we have a new shortest game. So first of all, let's make sure that we're getting the time. And we just get that time. If you remember how we did this, it's just going to be this float current time is equal to time dot start minus start time. I'm going to just copy and put it up here so that we can get what that time is. And now we need to check to see if we're either in the first game or if our time is shorter than what is currently in shortest time. So it's just going to be an if statement. If shortest time is less than or equal to 0.0f, because remember, that is if we are playing our first game. And our first game is always going to be the shortest game. So we want to make sure that we're taking this into account. Otherwise, if you don't put this in, you're never going to be able to update, since if our shortest time is always less than our current time, if it's -1, -1 is going to stay consistent. So we're going to check to see if we're in our first game or if shortest time is greater than current time. So first game, or we have a current time that is smaller than our current shortest time. We're just going to say shortest time is equal to current time. And this is storing it inside of this script, just to make sure, since the way that we write data to the screen is through this, we want to make sure that this is getting set. But we also now want to write to the global controller so that it's being stored. And we're just going to call it. We're going to say global controller dot instance, since that's what we're calling our singleton, is instance dot shortest time is equal to current time. Now, if we reload our scene, this is going to go along with it, and you're going to see that in a minute. And that's actually it. That's all we have to do. Since we are, that's all we have to do to save this out, is this. We're setting it equal to all that. So make sure you do save game state first, since that's when we're updating it, and then update that text on the screen. Because if you do this first, you're always going to have, it's not going to work correctly. So make sure that you do those in the correct order. All right, let's save this and let's do some tests. So I'm going to hit play. Let's see, it's our first game, and I'm going to take a long time to beat this one so that I know that my second game will be shorter. Let's go. So I'm going to purposefully sit here, and if we click on our stuff in our hierarchy, we can actually see what's being stored in there in play. So right now the global controller still has that -1, and that's correct because that is, we're in our first game. If we go to where our information is being stored, it's on the player, we also see shortest game time is -1. So now let's run into, that should be enough time, let's run into this. Our shortest game is now 47.17564. 47 seconds, it's 47.18 seconds. So that is now our new shortest game. If we click on the global controller, it is also now storing that. So watch what happens now when we hit play again. Global controller is still holding on to that 47.17564, so we know that even though we've reloaded this scene, it stored our shortest time. And since we're also reading it back now on our player, it also read that back, and it's displaying our shortest game. So let's try to do a faster one now, and it looks like there's only 3, so hopefully we can do this quicker. There we go. So it updated, and our new shortest game is now 9 seconds. And it wrote to the global controller, and we're going to play again. This time we do purposefully want to do it longer than 9 seconds, so we can double check that it's not just writing willy-nilly to it. So I'm going to take a casual, there we go. And it maintained that this is still our shortest game. If we click over, and that's still in the global controller. So even if we hit play again, it's still holding that data. And that should be it for working with this. So hopefully you found this interesting. It's a really important concept. It's a really useful concept. If you do want to continue on with that website and do it where it's serialized, feel free. Not required for this, and it's not going to be required for your project, but it is, some more interesting stuff. But hopefully you're able to get this working, and you can implement this now into your other projects.